Shanghai is about to enter the fourth week of lockdown, with many residents in the city of 25 million still being told that they can't leave their homes to buy food. Cindy Yu writes in this week's magazine that the people in Shanghai have taken to social media to complain and are using ever more subtle techniques to bypass Beijing's censors. Cindy joins me now. Hi Cindy, thank you for joining us. You write in the magazine about Shanghai's lockdown this week. Can you tell us a bit about the situation there for those who haven't been following the story as closely?
Yeah, of course. So Shanghai, like many other cities around China, has been dealing with an Omicron outbreak. The difference with Shanghai is that it's actually one of the leading cities in China which has been advocating for living with COVID, or as much as possible, living with COVID strategy. So it actually didn't lock down when it found its first cases earlier this year, which meant that by the time that it did lock down, the authorities didn't actually know how many cases there were in the city. A lot of these were asymptomatic anyway. So it spent weeks basically telling people, 25 million residents basically, we're not going to lock down, don't worry. Then it did lock down at the end of March, and it split the city into two in order to do kind of 1 week fire break, all the while saying this is how long it's going to be. And then it extended that indefinitely, and it's currently still an indefinite extension of lockdown. But this whole messy nature of the lockdown has meant that a lot of people just weren't prepared for the siege that then they're living under now. And bizarrely, Chinese lockdowns these days mean that you can't even leave your flat in the tightest areas. You can't even leave your flat in order to get grocery shopping or anything like that. So it's created this logistical challenge on top of the public health challenge, because the government is having to arrange rations, online shopping is severely oversubscribed. And then there's just the sheer number of infections that are happening in Shanghai at the moment. At its peak was about 27,000 in a day, meant that because everyone had to be centrally quarantined under China's zero COVID strategy, that actually there was, just not enough people to transport into these quarantine centres. There were not enough quarantine centres themselves in order to make this happen. So the government is basically dealing with a lot of different problems all at once at the moment.
And you mentioned there's some quite draconian measures. Are they having any impact at all on the virus itself? Are numbers reducing? Is it worth the sort of the measures?
Yeah, the numbers are reducing. So at its peak last week, it was about 27,000 a day, but right now it's a bit under 20,000. So we do see it coming down, but the government is trying to get zero COVID to happen by the end of April at the latest, and that's just not looking very good at all. It's a very ambitious target. So the numbers are coming down, but there are also questions about how effective these measures are, because under a zero COVID policy, you're meant to kind of quarantine anyone who might infect, right? But at the moment, what we're hearing are these stories about quarantine centres potentially having cross-infections, where people who are testing negative are put with people who are testing positive, creating these cross-infections, all in these mass testings that have become the norm in China, where people are just kind of squished up against each other. And there are social media videos showing this. And some people have started refusing to go downstairs to do these tests because they're worried about getting infected during the testing process. So there are all these questions where, just the sheer scale of infections is something that China hasn't seen before, and they're struggling under it.
And can you tell us a little bit about these sort of complaints we're seeing on social media and the kind of things people are sharing about their treatment in Shanghai?
Yeah, so I think that's the point that I pick up most on my piece, which is just this incredible moment on social media where so much of this chaos is playing out online, so that people like me sitting in London, Chinese people who are concerned elsewhere, can see everything that's happening. And obviously not every single person in Shanghai will be having a similarly terrible experience. There are those who are very well resourced, well-to-do, who can get enough food and who can get enough medicines and who do have the contacts. So I'm not saying that every single person of those 25 million in Shanghai are struggling, but a lot of people are. And they're going to social media, posting phone call recordings of themselves, talking to the authorities, posting videos of potentially arguments with the police, similar things like that, bad treatment at quarantine centres. They're posting blogs about people running out of food, people running out of medicine, and all of this is just providing too much for China's censors to deal with. So during the time that we're having these health workers dealing with the Omicron outbreak, we're also having China's infamous censors dealing with a social media outbreak. And they're struggling. They're really struggling because the volume of grievances is just something that they can't keep up with. And there was this really intriguing moment on April 13th between the hours of midnight and 4 a.m. where it just seemed like the censors kind of clocked off for a bit, and people were complaining about the Chinese government but under the guise of criticizing America. So maybe that's why it didn't trigger any warnings with the AI that's used to scour social media. But there was just this hours of just completely unfiltered deluge of criticism, and it was a really heartening moment to see because, and I quote, this one post in my article saying, "This is the real voice of the people. Commemorate tonight. At least I know that we are still awake. Though we travel in the darkness alone, there will be a day when we have the force of a prairie fire." Because people on social media don't normally see this kind of negative news. But, they're finding it heartening that the censors are struggling to keep up because they can see that there are other people struggling. And also a point that I make in my piece is that the authorities also respond to social media. So if you make a complaint on social media, even if it's deleted, someone somewhere has seen that. And we have seen evidence of the government basically backtracking or U-turning because of a social media backlash. So for example, one of the early things that the Shanghai authorities did was splitting parents and children when they were going into quarantine. So if the child was testing positive and the parent didn't, the child would have to go into quarantine by themselves, even if it was, a baby or a toddler. And that caused a massive internet backlash. And Shanghai authorities have now backtracked on that. So people know the power of social media is not just cathartic, it's also effective for essentially people who don't get to go to the polling stations. And the authorities are actually afraid of being humiliated or causing instability that start from social media. And so they try to, placate people, and they try to resolve these issues once they go viral.
And do you get the sense that this is triggering outrage on a sort of more national scale outside of Shanghai?
It's really hard to know, but for sure, not every single critic online at the moment are people in Shanghai. There will be people who are, complaining about the inhumanity of the lockdown, not necessarily being lockdown skeptic completely, but just the extent and the inhuman nature that, some of these policies, for example, splitting parents and children, have been carried out are. But there are also people who are taking this as a sign of, the arbitrary power of the Chinese government and criticizing that. And those are not necessarily people in Shanghai, but people who are watching Shanghai. And, I think it's interesting reporting on this lockdown throughout the last few weeks. There are a lot of schadenfreude, I think, from Western readers and observers. Haha, China's now dealing with its own pandemic. But actually, for Chinese people and, for people, I'm Chinese as well, it's actually very concerning. It's a doom-scrolling moment where you can't tear yourself away from social media because there are so many concerning stories. It's not funny at all, actually. And so a lot of people in China are concerned that A, this is happening in a city, the most economically developed city in the country, and that B, it might happen to them later on as well if something similar, a similar outbreak happens. So it's really concerning, and I think some people do draw political conclusions from that. I don't think this is going to go anywhere, though. Before people wonder if this is going to be the downfall of Xi Jinping or the Chinese Communist Party, I don't think it will go that far, because once they get this under control, Chinese people can tend to have short public memories, and they don't then carry that through.
And you mentioned in your piece as well about people trying to get around the censorship regime. Can you tell us a bit about the sort of the methods they're using to sort of escape the sort of the hand of the censor?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, just to explain how censorship on Chinese internet works, it's actually the social media companies themselves who carry out the censorship. They get briefed by the central government, probably weekly, on what are the banned topics and keywords. Then it's the social media platforms themselves who employ either in-house teams or external contractors, professional censors, if you will, in order to carry out these orders, to actually implement them on a granular level. So that can be manual, millennials, for example, who are apolitical themselves, but actually know far more about the darkest moments of Chinese history than your average Chinese person, because they have to be able to censor that. They're helped also by artificial intelligence, bots essentially that search for keywords, also scour pictures for embedded text in case screenshots are a way to get around that. And so people get around it by avoiding keywords. So instead of sensitive words like 政府, which means government in China, people just write ZF because that's the first letter of each of those syllables to refer to the government, and that seems to get around that. People post pictures upside down in order to get past the AI analysis of pictures. And there are also memes which refer to things to people in the know. So for a time, a picture of an empty chair was banned on Chinese social media when the censors caught up, because users had started using an empty chair to signify the late dissident Liu Xiaobo, who received his Nobel Peace Prize in absentia, so the empty chair. And so all of these ways people have of getting around things, and then also reposting. So you've got this fascinating environment where the Chinese people know that they are being censored. They talk about the censors openly, and they also talk about the methods of getting around the censors openly. So I read one blog complaining about the poster's neighbour who had died of an asthma attack because he wasn't seen at hospital fast enough because of the lockdown. And at the end, he wrote something like, please, if you see this, do not tag the government in it, do not tag any state media in it, but copy and paste, repost, because they can take one thing down, but they can't take all of us down. So, it's this dystopian world where people know that they're being censored and are trying to find all of these ways around it, and a lot of the time succeeding. So it's a cat and mouse game, basically.
And you mentioned about lockdowns potentially spreading to other cities. Do you think the criticism the government is receiving now is making that less likely, or do you think they're going to plough on regardless with sort of the zero COVID strategy if it does spread elsewhere?
So I think even zero COVID has degrees, because China has done zero COVID from the beginning, from January 2020. But what is bizarre about the Shanghai lockdown is just how severe it is, because not only are people locked down and people contact trace and centrally quarantined, something new has happened in Chinese lockdowns, which is that those in the strictest tier in lockdown in Shanghai can't leave their flats even to buy food. And I think that has caused a lot of the problems for people locked down, because at the beginning, you could get these permits for household, you could go out to do family shopping every other day. I'm not sure why they have stopped doing that. And the city of Xi'an over Christmas, when it was locking down because of Omicron, was the first to pioneer this strategy. And that was the first we saw government rations being sent out. But now Shanghai has copied it. But it's not the case for lockdowns across China. So I don't understand why it is that the Shanghai authorities themselves have gone for this extreme version. And they have been criticised and compared to other cities like Shenzhen, which have had much more humane lockdowns. Pets have been able to be quarantined with their owners, children with their parents. It's confusing, it's baffling actually why Shanghai has gone for this extremism. And there's conspiracy theories in China at the moment that because Shanghai was one of these cities advocating for living with COVID from the beginning, that there is this notion that they need to be made to suffer because they refused the lockdown. Now they need to be shown that method was wrong, and so they need to be suffering more. That is a conspiracy theory, but that is what a lot of Chinese people are wondering. Well, how did it come to this for the best city in China? So it is confusing.
And finally, before you go, Cindy, where do you think Shanghai goes from now? You mentioned at the beginning there that this lockdown was meant to last for a week. Do you think they've got many more weeks ahead of lockdown, or do you think it's coming to an end?
So last week, the city introduced this tier system where the city was split into 3 tiers. In the strictest tier, people can't leave their flats even still for food. Then there's a middle tier where you can leave your front door and just walk around in your residential compound. And then the most relaxed tier is where you can go to other relaxed tier neighborhoods. So that's relative freedom, I think, for the Shanghainese at the moment. But it does show that the authorities are seeing that they've gone through the emergency level of the lockdown now. The government has given them a target of actually meeting this week zero COVID. And the reason they can kind of come up with a goal like that, even though we've got 20,000 daily infections, is because they actually count asymptomatic and symptomatic infections differently. So in the official numbers, they only count a symptomatic infection as the actual infection. Of course, in Western reporting, we add on the asymptomatic infection because that is, more reliable. So it could be that by the end of this week, symptomatic infections have gone to zero, even if asymptomatic ones are still around. But Shanghai is hoping to shake this off by the end of the month, really, and I just don't know if it will manage to do that. The government certainly is throwing all sorts of resources at it, and there was talk before of the Shanghai Party Secretary getting a promotion before all of this happened, but I just don't think that's going to happen now.